Hi everyone, I'm Abram Chavez, and today I want to go over my honors project for my Music-4 class, and this is going to be going over environment and emotions on the composition of music. And specifically, I want to focus on the composer Frédéric Chopin. So, for those who don't know about Chopin, he is a classical artist, but from the Romantic era. So, that's going to be around the 1800s, which Chopin was born in 1810. So he was in the startup of that Romantic era. Um, and a little background for Chopin: he did grow up in Warsaw, Poland, and during that time there was a struggle for independence between Poland and Russia. So that is pretty important once we do get to the point where we're talking about Chopin and his nationalism. And really, during this Romantic era, we do see a lot of nationalism appear in music. So, this is a pretty good example of that. And just about Chopin in general, too, just some characteristics. Once again, he has strong nationalism for his homeland, fighting for independence from Russia. He was always pretty much shy of what many records show. He was pretty shy from childhood to adult, also hated large crowds. Um, and unfortunately, he did have pretty poor health throughout his entire life. So there was this kind of impending sense of death. It's always around the corner because he did have very ill health. But I kind of want to start off with his Piano Concerto Number Two in F minor. So with this, there is a little bit more background involved. Uh, with Chopin, he sent many letters to many friends. That was, besides composing, that was one of the ways he would express himself. He would write to friends. And in one letter, he wrote that his second movement, Larghetto, in this Piano Concerto Number Two, was inspired by a singer, Glaudowska. Um, so he was in a kind of a discreet relationship with her, and he did have this love for her. And in that letter, we kind of find out pretty directly that it was inspired, this movement was inspired by his love for her. And if we're examining the piece or just listening to it, we kind of start off with this dreamy and love melody. You could really feel it with all the trills, the high octave melody. It's a pretty nice melody. Um, and then we kind of get to this next part of the movement where we start to see things drop into lower octaves, more in the bass clef, right? And we kind of get this dreading kind of feeling. And it's this large contrast from our dreamy melody, right? And if we connect this to how Chopin felt about that singer, well, he did have a problem in confessing his true love for her. He was, once again, very shy since childhood, and just this kind of feeling of ripping at his heart, right? That he hasn't really confessed to her as much as he would have liked to. Uh, so this is kind of how this movement connects back to his personal life, and it's pretty direct. I feel like this is definitely one of those cases where it's pretty direct, where he says where his inspiration and what kind of things he's trying to express in the music. Um, and something also pretty typical of Chopin among all his pieces is that he doesn't name them, or like not typical titles or names. Usually they're like the previous one. It might be a piano concerto or a etude, but it's not something like a normal name of a song, right? Like I know some of Chopin's pieces have been named for him, and he wasn't a huge fan, like the Heroic Polonaise, which was just one of his polonaises. Um, but people just attached these names to them because it really did bring out these emotions in people. So Chopin was really great at expressing emotions in his music. But moving on to his Etude in C minor. And this is another one where people just gave it a title for their own, not Chopin himself, but just the public gave it its own title of Revolutionary Etude. And this kind of etude really comes in when we talk about Chopin's nationalism. So Chopin had left for Vienna from Warsaw, Poland, and while he was in Vienna, he learned about the conditions in Poland, in Warsaw, Poland, and they were worsening. And any revolts that the Polish did have against Russia, they were being defeated. And just hearing that made Chopin want to return back to Warsaw to help in the revolt, be an aid in there. But unfortunately, once again, he just had really ill health, so he couldn't really do much, even if he did go back. Um, and with these revolts being crushed, we get an excerpt from one of his diaries, and it's a whole roller coaster of emotions that's going on that he's writing down. It's going from hopelessness to fear and anger after hearing that his home was succumbing to war. It was crumbling apart. And in this piece, Etude in C minor, we kind of get that fiery spirit that Chopin had for Poland. It gives a kind of feeling of when will the suffering end, and is there no one watching over us? As we get these 16th notes going up and down, right? It's kind of like the circular motion. It's like, when will this end? Um, and it kind of gets across the same desperation and hopelessness that Chopin felt as he was hearing these things about these Polish revolts being crushed by Russia. And he really did have this strong sense of nationalism, and he really did want to fight for the independence of Poland. And moving on, one of my personal favorites is the Prelude in E minor. So there's another little story behind this one, right? In around 1938, Chopin and one of his new lovers, George Sand, which is a little bit more permanent this time. Um, well, her name was George Sand. That was her pen name, but her actual name was Aurore Dudevant, and she was a famous novelist at the time. But her and Chopin traveled to Majorca to try to see if Chopin could get better in the more sunny and tropical island, getting away from gloominess. So they were kind of taking like a little vacation to help out Chopin, and hopefully he would, in the hopes that he would get better. Unfortunately, though, in this vacation, they were met with really bad weather, and Chopin was actually left in worse condition, and he got sick again. Um, and the worst part of it all is that in this vacation, this is where he got diagnosed with tuberculosis. And this was also the same disease that killed his sister Emilia early on in his childhood. Um, so it's kind of really important to see how this piece could be reflected at the beginning of his life and also in this kind of mid to late stages of his life, um, where we still have this impending sense of doom, like this imminent death. Um, and at this point, for this trip, Chopin had completed, or not completed, but started some of his preludes, but he wanted to finish them and perfect the preludes. And he thought, the tropical island, the tropical vibes would help him, inspire him. But instead, he had this incurable disease. He found out that he had that disease, and um, looking back on the Prelude in E minor, it's a really strong piece of music for only 25 measures long. Um, just kind of going over the piece itself, one of the main things, right at the top of the music, it says espressivo, which just gives free range to performers of increasing and decreasing tempo. So performers could play around with that. Um, and just going over bass clef first, we have this almost chromatic downfall in the left hand, the bass clef, that gives this kind of gloomy and downstepping effect. And for the treble clef or right hand, we have this sense of reflection as the notes sob to one each other as we're going in between notes, just two of them. And we still get this beautiful melody from something that looks to be so simple. And with both of them together, we kind of have this sense of reflection as the notes sob to one another. So it's kind of like we're marching down sadfully, like we're thinking about how death is going to come. Like eventually death will come for all, right? But in this case, Chopin was pretty close to death. uh, so yeah, it was more like a crying hopelessly as we know that death approaches. But then in measure 9, we kind of get this change, and these notes together kind of create a sigh after a cry. You're almost done crying, so you kind of sigh, kind of to relax a little bit, and it's kind of like we're telling ourselves there's no use of crying over something that we can't control. But then we do return back to this kind of sobbing melody. But in measure 16, we kind of get anger expressed. We have some forte and some pretty strong chords, and it could be kind of reminiscent of the fact that there is no control over death. Like there's nothing we could really do about that. So it's kind of a rage there. And then right after that, we have a little bit back to that sobbing melody, crying, right? But then we kind of get this piece found. And with the notation of s'mores, we can see how the composition is slowly dying out. So we have the treble and bass clef kind of finally coming together almost peacefully. And we also get these fermatas over the rest, which I think is pretty important to showcase silence in a piece. And we're just kind of drawing out those rests, so we're drawing out the silence. And it gives us time for recollection and composure. And with that, we get a pretty stern but confident tone at the end of the piece. So we're done crying, and now it's time to move on, which is kind of how I look at that end of the piece. So just going back to the beginning there, we are trying to take a vacation, right? Chopin's trying to take a vacation, hopefully get better. He's met with horrible weather, and he's diagnosed with tuberculosis. And, you know, that goes back to how his sister died from the same disease. But still, even with this diagnosis, he carries on with composing. Not only does he finish his preludes, but he carries on composing other pieces. So that's kind of what I want to go over today. Just how these environmental factors, these experiences, are used and how they affect our emotions, composers' emotions, and they're all just inserted into their compositions, which I think is pretty special, especially if we're talking about this music without words, without lyrics, and we're still able to get across these expressions and emotions off of something that's kind of like another language, right? We have musical notation like forte, piano, crescendo, diminuendo, and it's just pretty amazing how composers can convey that kind of emotion when they don't even have to say a word. But that's pretty much all for today. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. I know I had a lot of fun researching about Chopin. But thank you for listening. Bye.